Hello, and welcome to this pre-recorded webinar on building rider confidence with me, Charlotte Christopher, equestrian coach and sports psychologist in training. So why do we experience rider anxiety? So basically, rider anxiety occurs when the perceived challenge outweighs the rider's perceived resources. So basically, when a rider's in a challenging situation, they'll make an appraisal unconsciously. They'll make an appraisal of the situation in terms of their demands, the demands of the situation, and the resources they have available to them. So if the rider, again, consciously or perhaps unconsciously, if the rider appraises that they don't have the resources to meet the demands of the situation, they will be in what is referred to as a threat state. Now, in contrast, if the rider um, uh, if the rider feels that they have the resources sufficient to meet the demand of the situation, they will be placed in what's called a challenge state. So, in both these states, there's an increase in heart rate, but the difference being is when the rider perceives that they do not have the resources to meet their demand, then the what we call temporal peripheral resistance. So the blood vessels will contract. So the blood moves more towards the center of the body, because if you're about to be attacked by something much bigger than yourself, you don't want to bleed out. So this means the muscles can kind of feel a little bit heavy and uncoordinated. Your thoughts rush. You can't think clearly. You're overthinking everything. You're overthinking all the things that might go wrong. Whereas in a challenge state, again, you've still got this increase in heart rate, but the difference is there's an increase in cardiac output. So the blood moves better around the body, and the blood vessels dilate, so the blood gets to the muscles more efficiently. So this means that the blood gets to the brain better, so you're more focused, you can think clearly, and your blood flows out to your muscles, so you feel like you can ride well, you feel like your body is performing well. So if you ever hear about athletes and they're talking about, I couldn't perform without my nerves, they're describing a challenge state, because what they're doing is they're taking the nerves of the competition, they're appraising it in a positive way, which then puts them in the challenge state. So it helps them perform better. If we think about this in terms of fight, flight, and freeze, a threat state would be the freeze state, and the challenge state would be the fight state. The challenge state would be the, preparing for action. So let's look now at these two components. So first, you have the evaluation of the situation. So why do we sometimes evaluate a situation to be more dangerous than actually it really is? I get a lot of riders that I work with when there's almost this kind of internal conflict, because on a conscious level, on a reasoning, thinking level, they're sort of saying, oh, I know my horse is fine, and I know I can do it, and I've done it in the past, and my friend says I can do it. And they get really cross that then when they put themselves in the situation, they still have this what we refer to as a threat state response, so this real panic response. Now I'm going to show you a video here which I think explains this really nicely. If my internet decides to play ball.
The human mind has evolved to think in such a way that it naturally creates psychological suffering. You see, back in the Stone Age, 200,000 years ago, life was pretty dangerous for our caveman ancestors. So if a caveman or cavewoman wanted to survive, their minds had to constantly be on the lookout for things that might hurt or harm them. And if that cave person's mind wasn't good at predicting, spotting, or avoiding danger, what happened to her? The default setting of the caveman mind was safety first, and we in the modern world have inherited this. Our modern minds are constantly warning us of things that might hurt or harm us. The caveman mind says, watch out, there might be a bear in that cave, you could get eaten. Watch out, that shadow on the horizon might be an enemy from another clan, you could get speared. Our modern mind then does worrying, predicting the worst, avoiding anything that scares you, anxiety in all of its different forms. Back in caveman days, you survive an encounter with a bear or a wolf, then it's useful to replay it. It's useful for your mind to go over the events and remember what you did to survive so that you're better prepared for next time. But in our modern world, we go over and over painful memories, dwelling on them, reliving them, even when there's nothing useful to learn or the lesson has been well and truly learned a long time ago. In the Stone Age era, as a caveman or cavewoman, you have to fit in with the group. If you are alone, you will soon die. So your mind compares you to others in the group. Am I fitting in? Am I contributing enough? Am I following the rules? Am I doing anything that might get me thrown out? Now, in modern life, we're always comparing ourselves to others. But the problem is, we're no longer in a small group. Our groups are enormous today, and we carry with us devices that constantly feed us images and stories of people all over the planet. This constant comparison ramps up our fear of being judged or rejected or not fitting in or just not being good enough. The caveman mind tells you you need more food, you need more water, better weapons, better shelter. The cave people who thought this way lived longer and had more offspring. Unfortunately, in the modern world, this manifests as greed, dissatisfaction, craving, wanting. It's never enough. I need more, more, more. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, these Stone Age thought patterns are intensified by the sheer pace and complexity of modern life. Our frantic existence, rushing from task to task, that never-ending to-do list. So when your mind starts doing this unhelpful stuff, as all minds do, remember it's not defective or abnormal, and it's not deliberately trying to make your life difficult. It's simply doing the job it has evolved to do, trying to keep you safe and save you from pain.
So I think there's a few key takeaways from that video, I think, that really matter here. I think the first one is that actually anxiety is completely natural and completely normal. I think secondly, I think we need to be aware that our brains are really trying to keep us safe from two things. First of all, harm. So it's trying to help us survive. It's keeping us away from danger. And also anything that's going to get us pushed out the tribe. So anything that might get us rejected. So let's look at the other component of the challenge and threat state. So the evaluation of resources, your self-efficacy beliefs. So the term self-efficacy was a term that was coined by the psychologist Albert Bandura. And self-efficacy is basically a very specific kind of confidence. So it's your confidence that you have the particular skills to deal with a particular situation. So when it comes to self-efficacy, there are four sources of self-efficacy beliefs. So the first one, and the one that's considered to be the most important, is mastery experiences. These are situations that create opportunities for you to see that you can cope in this particular situation. The second one is vicarious experiences. So by vicarious experiences, we mean watching other people do it, or also using imagery as well. So, you might feel better dealing with a situation because your coach or because your more experienced friend gets on and rides your horse and you can watch it and say, okay, yeah, no, I think I can do that. But we also use imagery, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a little bit later on. Physiological and emotional states. So, like we said earlier, it's how you interpret your emotional state. So, for example, in competition, if you're a rider, you sort of start to feel the butterflies in your tummy and you think, oh my God, I'm getting nervous. That means I'm going to ride really badly and it's all going to go really wrong. My horse isn't going to behave very well and I'm going to make a fool of myself. Versus the rider that goes, I can feel the butterflies in my stomach. This is my body getting ready for action. This is me switching on. I'm going to ride really well now because I'm good to go. And then finally, verbal persuasion. And this is particularly the point when the verbal persuasion comes from somebody who's considered to be a voice of authority. So perhaps that might be your coach, or it might be a more experienced rider. So if we're going to build our levels of self-efficacy, if we're going to be able to improve this evaluation of your resources versus the situation, the best way of doing that, as I said, number one in self-efficacy is mastery experiences. You've got to go out there and do it. However, what I would say, if I sort of take my psych hat off for a moment, put my coach's hat on, I would never put a rider in a situation. I would not use psych skills to persuade somebody that they are able to do something that's beyond their skill level. Yes, I wouldn't. If a rider's feeling nervous about going around a BU100 because they're a novice rider, well, that's sensible. That's relevant. Secondly, it's never a good idea to put a rider in a panic zone. So even if you perceive, as a coach, friend, parent, whatever, even if you perceive that actually you think that situation is perfectly okay for their level of riding, if that puts them in their panic zone, if they're saying, look, I just can't do that, that's just too much for me, you need to respect that, because as we said earlier, putting someone in their panic zone, putting them into their threat state, means they're less likely to have a positive outcome, and therefore they're more likely to have the negative experience that's going to follow. It's no good staying in our comfort zone. Now, as we said earlier, the brain's number one role is to keep you safe. Keep you safe from harm, keep you safe from negative judgment. So it's always going to want to keep you in your comfort zone. However, staying in your comfort zone does not offer opportunity to provide evidence that you have ability. So it doesn't provide those mastery experiences. So your stretch zone is the sweet spot. The stretch zone is the place where you are pushing yourself a little bit. You're providing evidence that you're able to cope with the situation, but you're not so panicked that you can't function, you can't think clearly. So putting yourself in your stretch zone. Now, from a psych perspective, as I said, we can come at this from two perspectives. From a coach's perspective, I would say confidence comes from competence. So, as a coach, you want to provide people with the skills and the technique and the ability that they can manage a situation. That's where they're going to feel confident. They're going to feel confident because they feel like they can cope with the situation. From a psychological perspective, we want to give riders the psych skills that when they put themselves in a stretch zone, they're able to manage their anxiety so that they're more likely to perform well and therefore more likely to have good experiences, and just change those associations they have with those particular experiences. So traditionally, I think people kind of expect, as a psychologist, they kind of expect that you're going to tell them to just think positive and not think negative thoughts, only think positive thoughts. And actually, that's really hard to do. So, if I was to say to you, for example, don't think about a pink elephant, it's really hard not to think about what you're trying not to think about. But even if you do, if I say to you, okay, don't think about a pink elephant, you might kind of, maybe you try to think about a yellow elephant, or deliberately think about something completely different. Now, the issue with this is that actually in that effort to actually think about something different, or try really hard not to think about the thing that you're trying not to think about, firstly, riders can get quite anxious. So they get almost anxiety around their anxiety. They can get quite stressed about trying not to be anxious. And secondly, if you think about it, if you're that's a lot of effort to try and not think about something. And particularly if we're either in a competition scenario, or we're hacking and we need to be a little bit on the ball, your focus needs to be on what you're doing. It doesn't need to be on wrestling with your thoughts. So the alternative is actually we don't wrestle with our thoughts, we drop the struggle with our thoughts, and we accept them. So this approach comes from a technique called ACT, which is acceptance commitment therapy. And the idea is rather than wrestling with our thoughts, we notice them and we accept them, but we don't fuse with them. Yeah. So the tagline there is looking at thoughts rather than from thoughts. So you can be an observer of your thoughts. That doesn't mean you have to fuse with it. So let's take, for example, someone, let's say a rider who's got a competition this weekend and they're feeling really anxious and they're saying to themselves, oh, I'm going to make a fool of myself. Everyone's going to be laughing at me. Now, you can't stop that thought coming up, and that's okay. And again, that's completely natural because, as we said earlier, that's your brain just kind of going, let's not put ourselves in a situation where we might risk being pushed out of the tribe. So that's completely natural and normal. So I am, I remember what I just said then. So, so, yeah, so I'm going to make a fool of myself. Everyone's going to laugh at me. If you really fuse with that, if you really buy into it and really let it engulf you, then actually you're going to feel quite anxious because again, you're thinking, you're believing it. I'm gonna get pushed from the tribe. I'm going to make a fool of myself. However, what we can do is we can notice it, but not fuse with it. So we can go, okay, so that's a thought over there. There it is. There's a thought. It's just a thought. It doesn't mean that you have to really buy into it. So a nice, quick and easy way of explaining this is with a few phrases. So if we take the phrase, I'm not a very good rider, I'm going to make a fool of myself and everyone's going to laugh at me. Yeah, so I'm going to make a fool of myself, everyone's going to laugh at me. Yeah, we really fuse with that, we really believe that. And when we fuse with it, you might find yourself trying to find excuses to get out of it. You might, maybe I'll leave it this weekend because I'm really busy and I've got a lot, and I'll do it a different day. And if you do get to the show, you're going to feel anxious. You're perhaps not going to ride so well because again, you're adopting the threat state because we've really fused with that thought. We've really taken that on board. Now, if we could use the next sentence, I am having the thought that I'm not a good rider and I'm going to make a fool of myself. Yeah, so I'm having the thought that I'm not a good rider. And then we can bring ourselves further away from that, as in, I notice I'm having the thought that I'm not a good rider. Yeah. So rather than taking it on board and really fusing with it, we're noticing the thought, but we're choosing not to take it on board. I often find it quite helpful when I'm working with riders. I often talk about thinking about this like an overprotective parent, the kind of parent that would be like, oh my God, be careful, you cross the road, and you're like, I'm an adult, I think I've got this. So we're not looking at our thoughts like really angrily and saying, oh, I mustn't think that. You just kind of go, okay, thanks, brain. Thank you for bringing that up. It's fine. I've got this. Recognize that the intent is positive. It's just trying to keep you safe. But let it sit, and then eventually you let it pass. So the second tool I wanted to kind of add to this toolkit, this is a bit of a whiz through. Obviously, these techniques, we could do a webinar on each of these techniques. So this is just a very, very quick overview about some of the options that we can use to help rider confidence. So imagery. So I'm a massive fan of imagery, and I think it's massively underused in equestrian sports. So in this context, in the context of building rider confidence, I would say imagery has kind of two benefits, two uses. So firstly, in changing the emotions that you have linked around a particular event. Yeah, so say for example, I said to you, okay, let's talk about hacking. If I use the word hacking, let's go for a hack or whatever. If I say to you the word going for a hack, everybody is going to have slightly different emotions attached to that word. It's just a word, but everyone will have different emotions that they've learned to attach to that word through previous experiences, things they've seen, things they've experienced. So if you've had, say, a bad experience at hacking, and the interesting thing about bad experience, and again, remember back in Russ Harris's video, he was talking about how have negative experiences, the brain wants us to remember them because it doesn't want us to make the same mistake. Really important that you remember that this isn't a good idea. Really important you remember that this is a risk. So when you have a bad experience, it's logged in your brain slightly differently to a normal experience. So firstly, the amygdala, so one part of the brain that's responsible for memory, gets really good. So so the amygdala stores the image very vividly. So it will appear really clearly, really strongly. And secondly, the hippocampus, which is another part of the brain that's responsible for memory. Now, this part of the brain provides a date stamp. So if I was to say to you, think about what you did on the evening of your birthday last year, you could probably remember, maybe you went out for a meal, you went out for drinks, and you can probably picture it, but you'll be able to see in your brain that that was a while ago. You'll be able to see through, how it looks and how it feels that it was a long time ago. Now, if it's a traumatic experience, it gets stored with that date stamp. So a traumatic experience will feel very much in the moment. So when we reflect back on traumatic experiences, they feel like they're really, really in the moment. They feel like they're very vivid. So for that reason, if you've had a bad experience, say again, we use the example hacking, you had a bad experience at hacking, then all these past negative experiences will come back really strong. And the easier something called the availability heuristic, the easier something comes to mind, and the more you think that that's likely to happen. So therefore, the emotional associations you have with hacking would be things like fear, anxiety, panic. Whereas if you've got someone who hasn't had those negative experiences and they love hacking, they go out every Sunday with their friend and they canter across fields and they, have a good gossip and it's relaxing, it's fun, it's exciting, then actually their emotions are going to be very different because their emotions are going to be around pleasure and enjoyment and fun. So one use of imagery is around the fact that we can use imagery just to start to alter those pictures that we have. Often say to us, it's a bit like having a Google in your brain. If I was to Google hacking in your brain, what would those pictures look like? So we can use imagery to start to alter our emotional links to particular situations. Now, the other really good use of imagery is the use of in terms of motor learning. Now, as I said earlier, I think confidence comes from competence. So if we say probably one of the fears riders often have is around spooking. What if my horse spooks? Yeah. And most of the time, if it's fine. People can cope with it really completely fine. But like, there's a good way to ride a counter transition. There's a good technique in riding a spook. Now, the difficult thing is even if, I could sit you down and we had a conversation and I would say, if you think about a really good rider, a really confident rider, and you think about horse spooking, how would they react? You'd probably be able to give me quite a clear idea. You'd be able to say, oh, and they sit quite deep and they'd be square on their shoulders, whatever. You'd be able to give me a clear idea of what that would look like. Now, however, if you are in that situation when your horse spooks, you might react very differently. So what that basically means is that your implicit knowledge and your implicit knowledge is slightly different. So your explicit knowledge, so that ability to verbalize it is good, is correct. However, your what we refer to as the procedural knowledge, that automated knowledge, is not so ideal. So imagery allows us to practice how the optimum way of riding a spook, and therefore starts to build those neural pathways in the brain and allows us to autonomize a desired response. And so when it happens in real life, we're more likely to automatically react well. And again, also, if we're riding the school, for example, it's a little bit windy and we're like, oh my God, what if my horse spooks? Again, we go through that evaluation, the challenge. My horse might spook because it's a bit windy, the trees are rustling. And then we go, have we got the resources? Yeah, we got this. So immediately you're in more of a challenge state rather than threat state, because your brain has gone, what if that happens? It's fine. We've got this. We've got the skills. I know I can do this. So imagery for me is a really, really useful tool when it comes to rider confidence. So lastly, I wanted to so far we've been talking about very much what we refer to as top-down techniques. So techniques that talk about cognition and thoughts and how they impact your behavior. So we also want to think about things from the bottom up, because an awful lot of what the information our brain takes in comes from sensory experience. So another technique that's really, really worth practicing in terms of, again, placing yourself in that stretch zone, knowing that you're going to set those goals to, okay, today I'm just going to do this thing that's going to just be a little bit of a challenge, just enough of a challenge. Another really great tool in your toolkit is to practice relaxation breathing. So basically, when we're in a challenging situation, our autonomic nervous system kicks in and it triggers our our sympathetic nervous system. So our sympathetic nervous system is, like we talked about with the challenge and threat states, that's the adrenaline kicking in and your body kind of getting ready for action. So evolutionary speaking, years ago, if we came across a saber-toothed tiger, our sympathetic nervous system would kick in, we'd be able to think sharper, we'd be able to act sharper, we'd be able to run quicker, we'd have more strength in our muscles because it wants us to be able to be proactive. So that's your sympathetic nervous system. Now, the problem is firstly, as we said before, sometimes the sympathetic nervous system is triggered when it doesn't need to be triggered. And we actually need to have that ability to trigger what we refer to as the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you think about the sympathetic nervous system as the accelerator, that's what kind of triggers this let's go kind of reaction. The parasympathetic nervous system is like the brake. That's what brings us back down into homeostasis. It's what brings us back down to being calm. So if you're in a situation and your sympathetic nervous system is getting a little over the top, so your anxiety levels are starting to creep up, and we all know how that can impact horses' behavior, it certainly impacts rider performance, then something like relaxation breathing just says to our brain, we're not at threat anymore. The situation is okay. We can now calm down. Yeah. So really, really good thing to practice. And there's so many techniques. You can go on YouTube. There's so many techniques out there around relaxation breathing. I really like color breathing, where you kind of breathe in a positive color, say maybe like blue or pink or whatever, and then you breathe out the negative color. So that might be like brown or black or whatever. Box breathing is really good. And a lot of people really like box breathing and counting breathing. There are lots of exercises out there, but I really recommend you practice and just have that in your toolkit when you're in a situation you just feel that sympathetic nervous system starting to kick off inappropriately and you need to bring yourself back down again. So, in summary, as I said, building rider confidence is a massively complex subject, but I'm hoping I've just given you a few ideas and given you a few tools in your toolkit. So in summary, set short-term goals. So we want to put you in that stretch zone. So what can I do next week? Well, I'm just going to push myself a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm just going to create opportunity for some mastery experiences. Secondly, use diffusion to change your relationship with feelings of anxiety. So stop trying to wrestle with anxiety. Anxiety is absolutely fine, but you do have that choice between when you start that anxiety coming up, in terms of whether you fuse with it, whether you let it sit there and let it pass. Remember, you can say to your brain, yeah, okay, I know what you're doing here, but we've got this, we're good. Thanks, brain, but we're good. Next, use imagery to establish strategies and automate optimum responses. So again, as I said, using imagery to help you, practice, because, I can't, again, as a coach and a psych, I find it very frustrating when people say, oh, let's do some imagery, and you're riding down the road and the sun is shining, it's all wonderful. And that can be great. Positive thinking can be really good. But then the coach in me always says, what if it's not? What if it's blowing a gale and there's a plastic bag in the hedge? I want to know, my confidence comes from not fooling myself into thinking everything's okay, but knowing that if it isn't, I have the ability to cope with it. So that's where imagery, I say, yeah, of course, positive imagery is great, but also imagery of every single situation you can think of. And really important when you do that imagery that you you do the positive bit at the end. The horse spooks, I respond like this, I then walk off and we're fine. And then finally use relaxation breathing in challenging situations to trigger the autonomic nervous system. Well, I should have actually said they're the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, when you're in a challenging situation, when you're putting yourself in that stretch zone, you kind of feel that anxiety coming up, you can use the breathing just to kind of bring it back down again. Okay, so that's us done. So thank you very much for listening. As always, any questions, get in touch.